Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to MHTV. As you can see, we're having an old school start again this week. It's lovely to have you with us, and we're going to be talking about the psychological mechanisms of bipolar. And we've got absolutely tons of ground to cover. So before I introduce you to our guest, who you may recognize from a previous episode, let me hand you over to Dave, and he can show you how you can join in tonight, because obviously we'd love to have your questions. Dave?
Hi everyone. Yeah, so if you'd like to get involved in tonight's episode, you've got the same two ways as normal. The first one is on Facebook Live. If you head to the Facebook Live chat, any messages, questions, comments, we'll obviously try and feed in as many as we can tonight. The other option you've got is over on Twitter, and all you have to do is include the hashtag MHTV. We'll be keeping an eye out for that, and we'll try and bring in as much Twitter comments as well. But without further ado, straight back to you, Nicky.
Fantastic. All right, so over to our guest, Thomas, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, yes. So thanks for having me back again. I'm going to talk about a slightly different but overlapping interest of mine, which is about bipolar disorder. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm an associate professor at the University of Southampton, and I lead kind of teaching there for our diploma in CBT for bipolar disorder. And I have bipolar disorder myself. So there's a personal reason that I'm interested in that.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because it's not that often you get somebody who's got multiple different perspectives on the same thing in terms of research, experiencing, living, just understanding from lots of different aspects. So please do feel free to ask anything that you want to, and we'll take the questions as we go through. But I think it would be a really good idea if right at the start we're just really clear. So when we're talking about bipolar, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so we're talking about quite a potentially serious, severe mental health problem. Probably affects in the UK about 2% of people at least, but we do know that a big chunk of people, by some estimates, potentially half of people with bipolar disorder in the UK don't have that diagnosis. And some work I've been doing with Bipolar UK, a report we found even now it's still, an average of 9.5 years from your first episode to getting that diagnosis. And it was actually worse for people who were diagnosed relatively recently compared to people who were diagnosed sort of 20 years ago. So we're talking about episodes of depression, which people will probably know about. So feeling very hopeless, low energy, lots of guilt, maybe feeling suicidal. And then episodes so there's hypomania and mania. So hypomania is kind of the less severe, but it can still cause quite significant problems. Yeah, so we're doing this. So, we're talking about a period, and this goes on for quite a while. We're talking about, days, weeks, where your mood is very elevated. You might have lots of energy, your mind's going a million miles per hour, talking really fast, big ideas, lots of confidence, not sleeping for days but not feeling tired. And then we can go to the mania where people might need to be hospitalized. They might become kind of quite psychotic, they might become paranoid, and lots of really destructive things that can happen when people are manics.
They're not
risky
necessarily
things they
looking
can
after
do
themselves, not necessarily being great with safety.
Yeah, it can be sort of neglect if you're depressed, but again with Bipolar UK, we found, for example, in women, I think it was most people reported kind of hypersexuality that can come when people are manic, and lots of consequences of hypersexuality that might come with that. Impulsive spending, this is where the link is with what I told you about before, is reported by potentially most people with bipolar disorder. And certainly people can take out like 20 grand and just spend it in like a couple of days on what they think is a good idea. And so it can cause really the big relationship problems, and unfortunately even kind of poor physical health, and even reduced life expectancy. There's a lot of consequences to it. Yeah, and I think that's important to say. We're talking about kind of discrete episodes here. Some people, they might have some lingering kind of anxiety and low mood in between episodes, but people can go for a long time being very stable. We're talking about episodes that can go on. Depression is at least 2 weeks, and then the sort of hypomania is kind of at least like a week. So we're not talking about the day-to-day ups and downs. We're talking about discrete episodes. And yes, people can recover really well in between episodes, but it causes huge problems. And actually, I think that's one of the why people with bipolar disorder can get a raw deal, is because they're stable for so long. They don't really get offered a lot.
And just to clarify something you were saying, are you saying that we're less effective at identifying and diagnosing bipolar than we've ever been? Is that all
Yeah,
recently?
I mean, it was a small change, but yeah, it was not, it wasn't getting any better. If anything, it was
What's
getting a
the
little
cause
bit
of that?
worse.
Because you would think that it was, because it's
Yeah.
quite noticeable, isn't it? 'Cause someone's personality is quite different, their behavior is quite different. So how is it that people are missing that's what they're seeing?
So, I mean, we found that it was even years from first contact with mental health services, and I think it's worth saying, you don't get a bipolar diagnosis from one kind of manic episode. You have to have at least a couple, because there are some people, similar to psychosis, who can have a episode of mania and then that's it. So you do need kind of a couple of mood episodes to meet it. I think it's missed often. I think the mania is missed, and a lot of people got picked up. They get diagnosed with unipolar depression, just depression. You know what I mean? Depression without the mania. There was a study we did looking at IAPT and recently, and we found that potentially 30% of people, largely undiagnosed in IAPT, are bipolar, but they're presenting for depression or anxiety. So I think it gets missed, and there's a few reasons for that. And I think we can come back to this to an extent. Sometimes people can enjoy the hypomania, before it goes too far and causes problems. So you don't tend to go and reach out for help when you're hypomanic. When it gets to the full mania, and you might end up being sectioned, or in police involvement or whatever it is, it might be forced upon you, but you're unlikely to go for it. You'll go for help for depression, right? The depression episodes go on, quite long. If you look at the lifespan of someone with bipolar disorder, they spend like that much time depressed, that much time okay, and then like that much time, and very little, comparatively speaking, time actually hypomanic or manic. So it's easy to get missed because professionals don't see it. If you're only seeing a psychiatrist every 6 months, they might not see you when you're in that state.
No one goes to the doctor because they feel too good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I do think it gets missed. It might get put down to other things by friends, family, colleagues. Oh, it's adolescent angst. It's drugs, for example. If someone on speed, cocaine, ecstasy, someone on mania look very much the same. So it can get put down to other things, But I think there's that problem is that people don't reach out for help. You go to the GP saying I'm depressed, but maybe not for the mania. And I think that's why we're trying to, with Bipolar UK, get people to ask about those highs, even if someone is presenting with depression, especially if they've, presenting with what's often called treatment-resistant depression, where they've tried CBT, they've tried antidepressants, it's still not working. Because, I mean, as a psychologist, I think what might be going on, there's this concept of like mood-dependent memory, right? So, we all have moods, but our memory is quite specific. So you'll be able to remember this conversation better when you're sitting in the room you're in, Nicky, right? Because context-dependent memory. Yeah, context-dependent memory, It's the same with your mood, so if you remember something in a good mood, you're going to be more likely to remember it in a good mood. So if you go to the GP and you're depressed and they say, have you felt like this before? You think back to all the times I felt depressed and all the times I felt bad. And you kind of just don't really register the times that you felt manic, So that's why you need to ask about it in a particular way.
Particularly if you're not associating that as a symptom.
Yeah, exactly. People see it as separate.
And you're like, oh, I'll look for problems. You don't look for the time when you felt on top of the world, that everything was coming together for you.
Well, that's it. People, and it goes too far and it causes problems. But to an extent, people, at least at an early stage, they don't realize often that they're unwell. I'm not unwell. I feel great. The night before I went into a psychiatric ward, I wasn't unwell. I had an amazing business idea that was going to change people's lives and make me rich. I wasn't unwell. So yeah, that's why you need to I think we need to ask for it. So I do think it gets missed and kind of put down to kind of depression alone.
I think as well, it'd become helpful to kind of dig into the sort of psychological mechanisms of bipolar, because considering it's one of the big serious ones, if any of them are not serious, but I don't think that's true, of diagnosis. I think people know much less about it than they do about depression and psychosis. So I wonder if we could just focus on sort of psychological mechanisms, what's going on.
Yeah, sure. So no, I agree. I think there's less research out there about the psychology of bipolar disorder compared to psychosis. Again, that's one of the stuff we've been doing with Bipolar UK, is kind of little bit of the kind of poor cousin when it comes to psychosis. We're not saying psychosis is getting too much funding or anything like that. We're saying that actually sometimes the bipolar research does get neglected. There's not as much research out there, and there's not enough people researching it. Yeah, I agree. I think maybe health professionals, but certainly service users, can have quite a medicalized view of it. And I'm not at all disputing. I find the diagnosis helpful. I completely, I think, the brain, genetics, I'm not disputing any of that, and the role of medication. And there is a really important psychological part which is neglected. So I do think people can sort of internalize this narrative that, I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who have had years, even decades with bipolar, and they have no idea about the psychology of it and what they can do to stay well. They really just think, all I have to do is take my medication, and it's not that simple. So one of the key findings, and something I'm kind of actively researching, is very high standards. I mean, this is similar to kind of people with depression. So what we call dysfunctional assumptions. So this is things like, if I work hard enough, I should be able to achieve anything. I've got to be outstanding in one major respect. So the goal-focused, high standards perfectionism is a really common trait, and linked to that, quite low self-compassion, quite hard on yourself. So quite perfectionist, high standards is part of that. And often the mania is part of that. It's goal focused. It's often trying to achieve something, trying to achieve a goal, trying to better your life, create a business. And there is a bit of research that there is potentially a bit of overlap between kind of risk for bipolar disorder and actually maybe successful leadership, successful entrepreneurism, actually. So big ideas, and maybe there are some people who have them risk it all and they pull it off, but then there are a much bigger group of people who, like the impulse spending, risk it all, and it really backfires and really makes their life hard. So these kind of big ideas, they've even done studies showing that people with bipolar disorder tend to have quite high ambitions for like fame and fortune, and that predicts mania, like over the course of a year. And
well,
I
it's
think
something you see with celebrities, isn't it? It's one of the ones you see most obviously, I think, between and again, it's the difference between someone who's widely recognized as a genius and somebody who's recognized as not very well, is whether everyone else agrees with you or whether it works.
whether you pull it off, absolutely. I mean, there is a stereotype about people with bipolar disorder kind of being tortured geniuses, and if you look through history, there's people such as Alexander Hamilton, US founding father, and Florence Nightingale, who potentially symbolic figure bipolar.
Look back and then try and claim people for certain diagnoses. Uncomfortable, isn't it?
It is, but there is this potentially unhelpful stereotype of like tortured creative geniuses, but there is a bit of truth to this idea. There's tend to score quite highly on measures of like inspiration and creativity. A lot of people report when they're manic, they feel very creative. That actually colors seem like brighter, and actually if you look in the brain scan, the kind of back of your brain that takes in the visual information is on fire. So that makes sense. I mean, the most shocking statistic, I can't believe this, but according to one study, if you've got an artistic degree, you're 62% more likely to be hospitalized for bipolar than the general population. So that correlation
is not causation. Everybody, calm down. If your background in arts,
it's not. No, it's not. But it's the kind of the creativity and the big ideas is very much part of it. Yeah, and I think all of these experiences, like a lot of mental health problems, some of those kind of hypermanic traits are, quite evenly spread in the population. And when it gets to a certain point and it causes problems, we call it bipolar. But they're all on a trait. So, if you describe yourself when you're really happy and you get really good news, you might go out, take risks, spend more money, not sleep,
Happy, delighted. Yeah, those
Yeah,
things
so you multiply that. Yeah. I think the other thing is that life events have a really big impact. And they do on, on all of us, of course. And, we all know as mental health professionals, working out people's triggers is just a really important part of, formulating and staying well. But there does seem to be something where actually these life events are particularly kind of problematic. If you think about stress vulnerability, and people who are bipolar just seem to be like especially hard hit by life events. And I think the key thing here is we're not just talking about negative life events, we're talking about good life events as well. That's the rubbish thing. So yes, not surprisingly, losing a job, financial problems, divorce, etc., that predicts depression, but positive life events as well. Sleep's a big trigger. That's again, bipolar UK survey, that was the biggest one. But we also found lots of people report triggers such as like getting promotion, going on holiday, getting married. They can be
causing change or disruption to your everyday patterns. What seems to be the
well,
issue?
I think part of it is it changes your usual routines, it changes your sleep pattern. But I think that these kind of high standards is part of it as well. So I can think from my own experiences, and my bipolar disorder and my career as an academic are like completely intertwined. I got hypermanic about my dissertation about hypermania when I was an undergrad. But I can think where I've had good news about research, like a grant or a paper published, and then because of my need to achieve, need to do more, it doesn't stop there. And it's like, right, I've got to keep this going. What can I do next? Big idea, I'm on a roll kind of thing. So actually you start to get a really busy mind and lots of big ideas from good news, and I think there's a lot of influences on this. I think some of the messages people get from whoever it is, maybe about their families, about success, and maybe they want to do well, etc. But there's also, we know there's a high prevalence of abuse in childhood trauma, high levels of trauma in bipolar disorder, and especially emotional abuse in childhood. So if you can imagine a child who was very criticized for not doing well, and they internalize this, I have to achieve, I have to do really well, and then actually it goes too far and they can make themselves unwell. That real kind of high standards, goal focused is just very key, because if you're relentlessly goal focused, if you meet your standards, you just up the bar, right? Just higher. And if you don't meet them, you crash into depression. I'm useless, I'm rubbish. So that real kind of black and white, defining yourself by your what you've achieved is really quite important. And self-esteem is part of that as well. The self-esteem is kind of quite variable. Crashes down when you're depressed, and then it can get very grandiose when you're manic. Yeah,
you can see some real issues, can't you? If people are struggling to get their issue recognized, on top of that, see another layer of isolation as well. So you've got maybe childhood uncertainty leading to sort of this sort of really harsh inner critic. Then you've got maybe people not pinpointing what the issue is. And also one of the things that's really standing up from what you're saying, it seems to be that a lot of self-knowledge is needed for somebody whose mood shifts. And that's really difficult. It's difficult to feel what the sea's doing when you're in the boat, isn't it? It's easy to look from the shore and think, the tide's coming in. But when you're actually in the boat, it's really different to understand whether you're getting higher in your mood or whether actually you're starting to crash. And I think one of the things what I can remember working with people who really struggled, knowing that a change was coming. So even when things were good, that worry that maybe tomorrow, or was it the next day, or was it the next month, that things won't be good. And
I think that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from, is that uncertainty. And I certainly, I felt, I had years feeling like, that's, what was the story, the sword of Damocles hanging over your head. It felt like that, at what point am I going to have a manic episode so bad? Because I haven't been in hospital since I was 18. I am fortunate. A lot of people with bipolar aren't as fortunate as me like that. But it felt like it's going to, fall, and I'm going to have a career destroying manic episode. And until I had therapy, and now I do feel like that has gone. So absolutely understanding your warning signs. Again, I think if people internalize this narrative that it's purely about medication. Medication is incredibly important, of course, but if they think that's the only thing they can do well, it's very disempowering. And it's like, it's like I've got this disease and I can't do anything about it, but actually there is, trying to reduce your activity if you're starting to get manic, that's really important. Being aware of your triggers, being aware of your early warning signs, even as simple as, and this, it's simple from where I'm sitting as a psychologist, but it's a revelation to a lot of people. If your mood's starting to go up, try to reduce your goal focus, try to prioritize, try to reduce stimulation. If your mood's going down, try to make sure you stay in touch with people, don't shut yourself away. And it's all about getting that balance right, not going from one kind of extreme to the other. And we know that the evidence for therapy is really good in terms of preventing relapse and reducing the need for hospitalization.
Can we talk a little bit more about that? Because obviously,
sure.
we're not sort of pill shamers here. To each their own. Very much that's very much our mantra, because everyone's experience is so different. It's not for anyone to tell anybody else how to experience or survive or thrive with these conditions. But obviously, medication is a bit of a blunt tool sometimes. And sometimes I think it can feel like that's all that's being offered. So I wonder if we could perhaps talk a little bit about maybe the evidence base for therapies.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is, really quite strong evidence in terms of it improving quality of life, it reducing the risk of relapse. So, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but also kind of just psychoeducation, group-based psychoeducation. And family therapy is really effective as well. Family-focused work, trying to help the family with, positive communication and helping understand the kind of relapse prevention. So, reducing risk of relapse, reducing acute symptoms of kind of depression and mania as well. So we're talking about very effective outcomes from, a group I used to run, which was like about 10 people with bipolar disorder in a group. So it was like 12 sessions for a couple of hours. We had really good outcomes there, and people reporting they feel like I've got a much better sense of living well with it. So that's what it is about, is keeping yourself well, living well, kind of having a good quality of life, even if you've got this. And actually, you said I said about being offered medication. I suspect everyone with bipolar disorder has been offered medication at some point. But it's disappointing how much people are getting offered therapy. It's not good enough. The NICE guidelines are really clear, right? They say that actually in primary care, so if people are under like a GP, psychological therapy should be the main treatment. And in secondary care, they should be as important as medication. Okay. That's the guidelines. Unfortunately, again, the reality, from what we've done with Bipolar UK is that it's not often the case. So we found, let me just check the stats here so I get my numbers right. So we found that.
Spot the researcher.
I know.
If you were straight up,
I don't want to get my numbers. I know. Well, it's a report I wrote, so I don't want to misquote myself. That would be. So we found that. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So 76%. This is in the UK, which is over 1,000 people. 76% have been offered therapy at some point in their lives. 69% have been offered it on the NHS, and we took quite a broad definition of therapy here. Counselling, psychotherapy, group-based, mindfulness groups, etc. So, 69%, which I guess that maybe that sounds like it's not too bad, but everybody should be offered it, really. Everybody should be offered it, and this group-based therapy, which by some accounts is even more effective than CBT, and from an NHS perspective, it's very cost-effective. Only 1 in 5 had ever been offered that. So, I'm just thinking about the 29% who have never been offered therapy. I'll read you one more quote from my report. I have never been offered psychological therapies despite numerous episodes of severe symptoms leading to inpatient admissions. It seems my episodes are only ever managed at crisis point with no follow-up until a further episode. I mean, most shockingly, So a quarter had specifically been told you can't get therapy on the NHS for bipolar. A quarter at some point. And half have had to pay for their own therapy at some point. And that's just not okay. So this is in the NICE guidelines, It just is a bit of a postcode lottery. It's not, it's really inconsistent. It depends where you are.
I'm just looking at some of the comments, things like that. So Lovelace, hello Lovelace, saying family being there for you really helps, and a bit of everything is what's most helpful, which is very true of all things. So well done.
Yes.
But, I think we're all aware as well that not all referrals for therapy are equal. So sometimes you'll come across older adults who are not referred on for talking therapy for depression, because like people are sad. It's like no,
it's not that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So no.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing, isn't it, if someone's having memory issues, that's quite different. But for people who have a straight up depression, there is a recognized pathway that's not different. And I think what you're describing, maybe there might be some people who are less likely to be referred. So could you talk a little bit about that? Because I know there's been research.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons, like I said before, that people with bipolar, I think, do get a raw deal is that they can be really stable, for months or years. So and this was the pattern we found bipolar UK for broader support, is that often it is just kind of managed as an inpatient and then discharged. And I have had numerous conversations with people over the years, where people go, wow, they're okay now. Well, I can't do therapy with them now, they're stable. And it's like, that's the best time to do therapy often. Is when they're stable, because it's relapse prevention is such,
practice, isn't it?
Well, relapse prevention is such a key part of it. So, it's kind of like, do you think we should maybe do some therapy now to stop them getting an inpatient next year? So I do think people do suffer as a result, because it is, other conditions like this, but I think the relapse nature of it it's fairly specific to bipolar, and I think that actually goes in
because it can
people's
take a little
favor.
while to be on the list. You might get better by yourself, or reach a point of stability, and then you've still got maybe 2 or 3 months, and people are so keen to get the waiting list down. They're like, you're fine now, pop you off the list.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's part of it. And there's also, I'm doing some work on this actually, and I'm happy to say I have that IAPT is, historically IAPT would exclude people with bipolar disorder, and a lot of people fall through the cracks between primary and secondary care. I was initially told, and a lot of people have this is because I hadn't been under secondary mental health for a few years, and I was kind of told, well, yeah, you are bipolar and you need some medication, but you don't really meet the criteria for secondary care. But IAPT won't touch you because you're bipolar, so you're gonna have to pay for it yourself. Eventually I managed to get some therapy, which was amazing. But I think falling through the cracks, and so I'm trying to survey at the moment actually about, again, what IAPT services do it. And I'm happy to report I've trained one IAPT service just last month who wants to do more for bipolar, because they feel like they're getting a raw deal from secondary care. So that's really positive. Because like I said, we published this paper, they're actually, a lot of people in IAPT are probably undiagnosed bipolar, and they do equally well from your standard CBT. Right. So
I didn't know that, so I bet you loads of people don't.
Yeah. But I think I don't know if there's gender differences, and we haven't looked into that yet. I'd be interested. We do know that there was actually the male participants in our survey tended to have longer to get that diagnosis. But we do, there was a study in looking at a big chunk of South London a couple of years ago, and they found that Black service users were less likely to be offered CBT for bipolar disorder and psychosis, which just makes my blood boil,
and it's so important to keep an eye out for it as well, because if you're seeing somebody meet the criteria, then you need to advocate, and you need to call it out and say, what's the rationale that this is not happening?
Absolutely. And
and as soon as you start to pull it up, everyone's like, oh no, then fine. That's fine.
And even if they're well, even if they've been living it with for ages. I work with people who've been living it with for decades, and they still find it really helpful. And there's a recently published trial about bipolar disorder in older adults, like a recovery focused approach, and that showed promising results as well. So I think people need to ask for it. And I think that in terms of who's being offered, again, I'm trying to just we're trying to do a survey at the moment about people's experiences of accessing therapy. But it's just a bit of a postcode lottery. I mean, the thing is with, you know, with psychosis, because we have early intervention in psychosis, and there are targets, and it's very structured, so there's a lot more consistency depending on where you are in the country. With lots of other mental health problems, including bipolar disorder, it just varies where you are. There are a handful of specialist bipolar services, you know, so it's a dedicated team for bipolar disorder, or a dedicated team for psychosis and bipolar disorder. And there's other parts of the country where you're in a generic CMHT with everything else. And I get people from, you know, because I do private practice, I get people from all over the country saying, even when they've been incredibly unwell, I've been told I will never be offered therapy here. Can I pay you for it? You shouldn't have to pay me for it. That's appalling, you know? Can't imagine someone with diabetes being told, if you were 20 miles down the road, you'd get insulin on the NHS. But because you're here, you know, and that's the problem, is it is just a bit, there's the lack of consistency.
And it's so strange, isn't it? Because you've got nice guidelines and you've got an evidence base.
Yeah.
And again, it's this, how many staff you happen to have dictating what you can ask for. So I guess, you know, there's something to be said for staff speaking up about this and making sure the referrals are equal and fair, and making sure that their services are actually understanding. So when you ask for a referral for psychology or for talking therapy, you're asking for, not for someone to be cured or something like that, you're asking for somebody to be talked through about the trauma of being unwell, how frightening and upsetting that must be. And to look at building up a real toolkit of coping strategies and ways to manage any potential problems in the future. So if you're really clear about what you're trying to achieve, you're much less likely to have the services you're working for hoofed off the list.
Yeah, exactly. And offering it to people, not just when they're in crisis point, you know, it should be offered to everyone. So the relapse prevention is focus is key, but often it does need to go deeper, and it needs to think about trauma, and it needs to work on softening up. You know, that was part of the therapy I often do, and part that was really helpful for me was understanding where those high standards come from and trying to soften them up, you know, thinking about values rather than goals. It was truly life-changing for me, just to wind down that incessant drive that was part of both the mania and the depression. That's really important. And I think another part of the work is often just working with, because I think this is a little bit unique to bipolar disorder, is part of the problem is that people enjoy the mania to an extent, you know, not everyone, but sometimes, not everyone, not always, but there are a significant portion of people who don't want to switch it off. They know that it's going to go too far, you know. So I was running a relapse prevention group once, 10 people. Who wants to stop getting depressed? All of them put their hands up. Who wants to stop getting manic? One person put their hands up. And I was like, this is a relapse prevention group. Like, you know what you've signed up for, but you know, people want to risk their feeling like, you know, they've got sex drive, they're feeling like they're confident, you know, my social anxiety's disappeared. It's very alluring. You know, if you've been depressed for months and you've got no energy and no confidence and no sex drive, and then you start to get manic and that all comes back and then some, it's very, very tempted to go with it, you know, even if you know it's only going to go so far. So that's often part of the work, which is difficult but really important, is trying to get people to realize, you know, there's a model I use by Warren Mansell, who was in Manchester, now he's in Australia, which is really helpful, which is actually what turns that kind of early warning stage, you know, prodromal stage, into a relapse, is how you think about it. And often with mania, it's actually, I can be really productive, I'm going to be really fun, you know, my sex drive is back, and then you go with it and you do all of these things like socializing and spending money and taking drugs that just bring your mood up and up and up. So there is a window where you can intervene and people can realize, I'm going up, I'm going down, I'm on a slippery slope here.
It also depends what else is going on for you, doesn't it? Because I mean, you get this all the time, like, why does anyone want to be in a mental health ward? And it's like, well, if you are absolutely isolated, cold, you don't have enough food at home and you're lonely, being around people, even in a noisy, chaotic environment, is better. And if you are somebody who really experiences real torture in terms of like self-doubt, problems with esteem, isolation, and then all of a sudden you don't have to be that person even for 5 minutes. It makes absolute sense, doesn't it? And then you hear all this stuff banging on about, why don't they take their medication? You're like, well, why do you think?
Yeah.
A tight bit of empathy.
Some people, it is a, well, I mean, it I think people do say it does feel like a drug, probably in terms of the brain, it's acting very similarly, mania and, stimulants. It's very tempting to go with it, even though if you know it's going to go too far, because it's a holiday from, it's a holiday from your low self-esteem and your depression, and feel that feeling. It does feel amazing, and that's kind of the problem. So often part of the work is really trying to work that. If we want to stop someone getting that well again, we need to get them to realize that it's very hard to switch it off. People want to try and use the mania to switch it off, but it doesn't work like that. It just it's a risky game because it spins out of control.
I've got a couple of questions. I don't know which one you want first. One's philosophical and one's personal. I think they both sound like nightmares. Which would you like?
Hit me with a philosophical first.
All right. Hello,
please.
Chris.
Yeah.
Nice to see you today. A philosophical question. I think persons with bipolar and perhaps other mental health issues or mental illnesses question their authenticity. In that, does the bipolar, that relapse of the symptoms, make up the person, or do the symptoms of the illness move the person away from their authentic self?
Oh, yeah.
Go.
Oh, that's a good one. Oh,
I know.
Oh, that's a good one for a Wednesday evening. So, I mean, I think it's a difficult one where the personality ends and where the mental health problem lies for bipolar disorder is difficult because, again, they might be creative and bubbly and high energy generally. So certainly, we wouldn't want to take that away, but I think it's about learning where the line is.
Yeah.
And that's part of the relapse prevention work is like, so like I, for example, have big ideas and, writing a book about bipolar at the moment. But and that's fine because that's a long-term thing that's been going on for years and still dragging on. If it was like, I've got to write a book now, that's different. So that's often a rule of thumb I will say to people, so I think that, if you've got a big idea, fine. If it has to be done right this very second, then maybe that's the mania talking. So there is an overlap. I think that's part of the work, which can be hard, is trying to work out, is this me? Is this starting to become unwell? Because there's a lot of grey area there. Yeah,
it's asking a lot for people to understand the nature of self, isn't it? I think on that, particularly when your core, your center is shifting like a pendulum. Sometimes that's complicated. The thing I remember Rachel Perkins saying was staff having a tyranny of low expectations for people, and that's something I always really try and be really careful about, because you're writing a book and you're an academic and people are like, oh yeah, that will probably happen, like it will for academics. People are, oh yeah, if you're working in a supermarket you might be equally capable of writing a book. But sometimes when people hear somebody talking about their dreams or their hopes or expectations, like, but you're mental. So no. And I find that really troubling as well, that idea about we can put restrictions on people.
It's hard to draw the line between what is a good idea and what is potentially mania. My wife's a useful barometer for that.
I'll bet.
Is this a good idea, or am I potentially but I do think the sleep on it rule. If it's still a good idea now, it'll still be a good idea next week. I think that's a really important one, and that helps separate that. Is this me being a little bit, excitable, ambitious, or is this mania? So that impulsivity, I think, is quite a key one there. Yeah.
And so with the personal ones, and you can pass on them, they're not as bad as I've made them sound out, don't we? There's two of them, and they are roughly sort of asking, how did you get into being into psychology? Because people always know that. But also there's sort of like a question about, when did you understand that you had sort of ill health to deal with as well, and how do those two things inform each other?
Oh yeah. Oh, they're completely overlapping. Like I can't, as you've seen tonight, it's very hard for me to talk from the academic point to the clinician point and the personal point. I can't really separate them because it's all one and the same. So I mean, I had a manic episode when I was 18, and I was already interested in psychology, and I was going to be doing psychology at university. And I had this, there was a long build up to it and a lot of triggers in retrospect, but it escalated quite quickly. And I had this grandiose idea that I was going to set up this international business with, £200 in 2 weeks with no business experience. And that was totally doable.
Yeah.
And I was offering strangers on the street a job and that kind of thing. And so I was in hospital for a couple of weeks, and then I kind of, slowly recovered and went on a gap year and then went to university. I was doing psychology anyway. So that certainly piqued my interest in mental health, but I was quite interested already just from people I knew who had been through struggles, when I was growing up. I definitely had I'm one of those people who falls into that category of missed, not 9.5 years. I was fortunate, but I definitely had a undiagnosed kind of hypomanic manic episode when I was 16. But it just wasn't picked up at the time. It's put down to teenage angst, I guess, to be honest. And then, so I did my degree, and I had kind of a couple of relapses, but I kind of started to get my work experience. So it's interesting. I have actually done a whole nother interview about my career and how it overlaps. So I'll try and keep this brief.
Send us the link and we can forward it out.
Okay, yeah, we'll do. Yeah. There's an organisation called Integrate, which is specifically for the mental health and mental health professionals. So I've done an interview for them. And then I sort of work experience after I graduated and did the doctorate, but I kept it very quiet when I was training. I told on a need to know basis. It was only when I was qualified a few years in that I became very open about it, which was pretty liberating, but it was very scary. I remember spending a few months going, have I just destroyed my career? So it's really liberating that I can do this now. But, there are, I do still feel a little bit vulnerable sometimes. And I remember got told when I was a grad, research assistant as an undergrad to someone like, you should keep that to yourself. Some people do look down on mental health professionals with their own mental health, which is absurd, because that's often the reason we go into it, because of our experiences or someone we cared for, or there's a reason we're interested in mental health. So it's not essential, of course it's not. I do think it just helps with some of my research ideas come from my own experiences, like the impulse spending, and I don't always tell my clients, but it's never gone down badly. I have had one bipolar group suss me out. Tom, you really, really get it. Are you bipolar? And it was like, I'm. And actually, when I have been open about it to colleagues, get lots of other people saying, I've had my own stuff as well, but I felt like I couldn't talk about it. Why not?
Isn't it sad that we did it for such a long time? I mean, that we had like colleagues who stood shoulder to shoulder with us, and with this idea that mental health is something that happens on the other side of the glass, and everyone in here is fine. Even just looking around, everyone here is not fine.
That us and them mentality is no. I mean, you've got to be careful, because you have to be well enough to look after you have to look after self to look after the people. You have to be well enough. I think it's generally helpful for me, but I do have to be careful. If I'm depressed and feeling quite hopeless, it's very hard for me to work with someone who is also depressed and hopeless, because they're like, everything's awful, and you're like, it completely is.
You're right.
I'm not going to help restructure that thought for you. I'm just going to, it's because it can be a little bit contagious, So, but I just have to be aware of that, and that's fine. And
absolutely,
I've never had a bad reaction from service users who I have told.
That's a good thing. I think it depresses me that it might be staff, but I think tomorrow's problem, isn't it? Sorting out stigma right now. Let's finish this. Last couple of questions are, how can I help? What a lovely question. So what can people do to help, and what are your plans in the near future to move this conversation, this understanding forward?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I'm on Twitter, just at Dr. Tom Richardson, very imaginative. If you do have bipolar disorder, I've got some surveys on there asking about your experiences, and so one about experiences of trying to access therapy at the moment. I think Bipolar UK, I work with them. I'm on their kind of commission and their advisory panel. They're just doing amazing work, and they've got loads of resources on their website, but also keep an eye out, because they're often looking for yeah, I think there's places you can volunteer, but they're also looking for people with bipolar disorder, sometimes clinicians, lived experience, carers as well, to complete their kind of research as well. So they're really pushing it forward. Yeah.
I've just looked at the time and realised we've been going for ages. Sorry, everybody. We need to think about how we're going to wrap up. I'm also aware that I've totally ignored Dave this week. Anything that you wanted to add, Dave? Well,
I've got to say, Nicky, even though you have completely ignored me, I don't mind. And also, I've been keeping myself very busy by tweeting lots of links to the information that Tom has been sharing. So over on Twitter, you've got the links to things like the NICE guidance that he's mentioned, and also the interview that you did with Integrate. There, I've put a link to that as well. So anyone that wants the easy kind of links, head over to MHTV on Twitter.
okay. Is there anything that you can leave people with, Tom, just for people to really read or to know what's coming up? Any work that's coming up for you next?
I mean, I think that the Bipolar UK report we did, which is just on their website, it's called the Commission Report, makes for some good reading. And I will give a plug actually to, I've just written a foreword for Cara Lizette, who has written a sort of workbook for living well with bipolar, and that's going to be coming out quite soon. Yeah, so that'll be good. It's called I think it's called the Bipolar Workbook. I just ended on a positive note actually. I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Some positive nature is some positive movement is one of the reasons. One of my roles at the University of Southampton is training psychologists, nurses, social workers to be CBT therapists, and there's the Department of Health actually has pumped a lot more funding into so it's so for personality disorders, for CBT for psychosis, and for CBT for bipolar disorder. So Department of Health has noticed. I think there's a few IAP services that I'm trying to work with that are maybe wanting to do more with bipolar, which I think is a great idea. And the number of clinical psychologists has been increased as well over the last couple of years, and that's bipolar is part of that, not all. So there is some kind of positive news there. Yeah,
absolutely. So for anybody who wants to understand more, do have a look at our links. And coming up next week, it's our Christmas special next week, isn't it? The end of term, everybody. And we're really lucky we've got students in next week. So goodness knows what's going to happen, but fingers crossed we all come back in the new year. So there will be Bryony and Tanisha. So if you do have any questions, queries, or you want to join in and talk about student life, please do. And until then, we'll see you next week. Thank you very much to our guests, and to Dave, obviously, Stalwart, and to you guys for watching. It's lovely to see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.